Hello, GRCSU, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Coaches. And we have our super awesome guest again with us today. And this week, they are going to be talking about one-on-one coaching or conferencing. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So you guys want to just jump right in?
I'd love to. Let me go ahead and share our presentation here. All right, so we're going to talk about one-on-one conferencing today. So we'd like to start out by talking a little bit about why would we have these one-on-one conferences. So they're great for relationship building. It gives you a chance to sit down one-on-one with a child, talk about their learning, and also really get to know them as people and students. We also use them to get to know students as readers and mathematicians. So really digging into what are they able to do in reading or math, and what are the next steps to move them forward. They're used to gauge student understanding and progress, to facilitate student reflection on the product and or the process that we might be teaching, ask questions that move students forward, give students feedback, and that's a great way to help them move forward, and address student needs based on classroom observations, student work, etc. So lots of different reasons why we might hold these conferences, and we're going to talk about the format of the conferences next.
So I kind of think of the one-on-one conference as a learning opportunity for both the student and the teacher. The student, hopefully, by the end of it, has some clarity and some direction on where to go next. And for the teacher, we gain some insight into how the student is approaching the work, how they're thinking, any struggles they might be having. So it's definitely a win-win. I also want to mention that, before I get into the details here, that it's very doable both in school, in person, and remotely. I actually met with a couple of students one-on-one this morning remotely and had fabulous conversations. And they're not students that I work with regularly, but I feel like I know them so well as mathematicians just by spending 20 minutes one-on-one with them this morning, having a little chat. So one-on-one conferences are typically brief. I just mentioned 20 minutes, which is very long. It was for a specific purpose, more of a diagnostic kind of purpose in my role as a coach, trying to figure out what's going on for a couple of kiddos. But typically when you're meeting with a student in the day-to-day kind of work, it would be 5 to 7 minutes. On average, it could actually be anywhere from a minute to 10 minutes, but average 5 to 7 minutes, not very long. We want to emphasize being prepared. So basically knowing your students and knowing your content, thinking about what they're working on and where that range of learning might be for them, as well as just knowing your students as learners, their learning styles, preferences, their level of confidence in the work, that kind of thing. So just to be prepared as you approach a student to have a conversation. Always recommend starting with a positive, so finding something in the work to complement, and then to move on from there, wanting to help the student move forward in their learning. So you might discuss the work that they have in front of them. And I would say most of the time the student should be doing more of the talking than the teacher. But there will be opportunities or places where you need to do some pre-teaching, reteaching, just clarifying things for students. So there might be a little teachable moment there. Opportunities for the student to practice with that one in that one-on-one setting. They can practice with support. It might just be a matter of you watching them get started and then saying, looks like you're good to go, and wish them well and tell them that you will come back and check in on them at some point or look at their work. You want to make sure they understand that there's going to be that follow-up. The student at the end of a conference should have a sense of what their action is. So that link to independent work, it should be a student feeling at the end of the conversation with the teacher that I can move forward on my own now. Might not be to completion, but I can do at least the next step. And then we would recommend that at the end of a conference, might not be immediately at the end because of your classroom structure, you might move on to another student at that time, but at some point soon you want to, jot down some notes that will help you in revisiting with that student the next time, kind of keeping track of where you left off. So coming up with some kind of record keeping system is ideal.
So we're going to talk about reading and writing conferences specifically. So the example here is following Jennifer Saravallo's format of reading and writing conferences. And I did link at the end of this PowerPoint a site that explains each of these different parts of it in detail if you'd like to take a look. But she suggests that you research for about a minute, you decide what you're going to teach and what you're going to complement. You give that complement, you teach the skill, you help, as Kathy said, coach them for a couple of minutes, and then you link to the work they're going to do outside of that. So when you go into your conference, I would suggest that you have some kind of idea what you want to work on with your student before the conference begins. So being prepared before you even sit down with the student. Typically, you're going to have the student using their independent reading book or an authentic writing piece that they've been working on. And then you might use a conversation starter. For instance, you might say this and point to something, looks really interesting. What happened here? And give the student a chance to respond. Or what do you think will happen next? And this, as Kathy said, giving the student the chance to do most of the talking while we listen and ask questions. We want to jot notes of what was discussed so that we can plan for our next conference. So we might be able to say, last time you predicted this was going to happen in your story. Did it really happen? And the student can expand on that. And then we wanted to talk about COVID year versus a typical year. So in a typical year, we run a lot more small groups, and one-on-one conferencing would support those small groups. Whereas this year, I'm finding that most people are using conferencing much more frequently than we typically would. So those conferences may end up being a little bit different than what I just talked about. I've seen some teachers really try to pull what they would have worked on in a small group and do that one-on-one. So if you have a student who really needs some phonics work, you might sit down and just do that phonics work with them. So really this year, things look a little bit different, but you could still use the conferencing in this way if you'd like. I thought I'd give you an example both in reading and writing and what that might look like. So again, you research. So your student might read aloud to you, or you might discuss the text with them and decide what is the student doing well and what is the next step to build on that strength of theirs. Then I would decide what the complement is and what my teaching point will be. You have to decide that relatively quickly, which is why I suggest that you have something in the back of your mind prepared for the student. A complement might be, I noticed when you were talking about the story, you were able to identify the main idea of the text. Let's work on adding in supporting details to support the main idea. And that becomes your teaching point. So you take a moment to teach a student how to identify supporting details. You then take a few minutes to allow the student to do the work with your support there. So allow them to identify a few supporting details. And finally, link it to the work that they're going to be doing. So that closure piece. Today, we worked on supporting the main idea with details. When you're reading in your independent book, I want you to keep thinking about how you would identify a main idea with supporting details. So other strategies that you might include in your conferencing would be comprehension skills, decoding, and fluency, things such as, I noticed you weren't using punctuation as you read. Let's practice that, or expression, things like that. A writing example might look something like this. So you would allow your student to share their writing piece with you. Again, identify one thing to complement and one thing to teach. So as an example, I love how you use dialogue. It really made the story come alive. Today, let's work on how to punctuate the dialogue. So you're identifying something that they've done well and you're building on that strength. You take time to teach how to properly punctuate that dialogue. And then you sit with the student as they find other places in their writing that they can correctly punctuate that dialogue. And the link would be when you head back to work independently, continue editing the work for the dialogue sections. So other strategies you might talk about in conferencing might be editing, spelling, punctuation, complete sentences, things like that. Also, content. Are you using juicy details, topic sentences, conclusions, etc.? So lots of things you could talk about, but the most important thing is that you teach one skill and not overwhelm yourself or the student during the conference.
So specifically in math, I would say that typically, again, I'm kind of sorting it out like Lindsay did between typical and then COVID, which looks a little different. But typically, one-on-one conferencing would happen during student independent work time. So thinking about more of a workshop model where we might have a launch and then a main lesson and then some independent work time where teachers would pull small groups to work on specific things. And again, this connects to our previous session on sorting student work. So from that work sort, we developed small groups of students that would be working together with the teacher for a specific purpose. And now because of COVID, we're often doing the one-on-one instead. But even typically when we sort, there may be students who just don't fit into a group and we want to meet with them one-on-one for a specific purpose. Also, during independent time, we really want to touch base with all students. We want to help all students move forward. So there's different reasons to have the one-on-one conferencing, but often typically it's during that independent work time. And I think of the phrase problem solving is math. So typically in my mind during that independent work time when you're conferencing, they're working on a math problem, not a worksheet of facts kind of task, but a problem that they have to work at, maybe struggle a little bit with. So we like kids to have some time to get started on their own and teacher kind of wandering around and observing the students and then identifying specific students who would benefit from a conference for whatever reason. And then when a conference starts, start with open questions, just similar to what Lindsay suggested, noticing something and asking the student to explain what's going on here, and then narrowing it down perhaps to a more specific question related to the work, just really wanting to get at the students' thinking. Giving a compliment again and narrowing down the work so that, again, they can end the conference with an actionable task, knowing what to do when the teacher walks away. I think it's important that they hear that you're going to follow up with them by either coming back and meeting with them or looking at their work. So you're leaving them with something to do and then making sure that there is that follow-up. I like the idea, the quote at the bottom of this page, of thinking of the teacher as a coach. When you think about in sports, a coach wouldn't necessarily do things for the players, but help them to understand how to do what they're doing better. So I think that was kind of a nice thing to connect to. I also like the idea of thinking about teaching math the way that we teach reading. So when you think about what kind of book you're putting in front of a student, or what book a student might be reading when you're conferencing with them, we also should be thinking about the problem that is in front of the student and thinking about that idea of instructional level or a just right kind of task versus something that's too easy or too difficult. Of course, we don't want to give anything that would be at a frustration level. If we give a student a word problem or a problem solving task in math and they can do it mentally, that's not the kind of task that we want to sit down and work with them on. We do sometimes ask kids to document, like show us your thinking in writing, but we really want a problem that the student has to work at a little bit, use a strategy or a model to figure out the answer, not have the answer and then just think about how am I going to show my teacher my answer. There's a difference there. So we really want to think about putting the right task in front of a student. Sometimes we can give the whole class the same task, which it would not be just right for everyone, but then we can have kind of a part B to the task where if students can easily solve the initial part of the story, then we might tell them to go on and do the next part of it, which would be more challenging for them. So there are a lot of ways to do that. Another way is to have the same situation in our task and change the numbers, and that can make it very different for kids. So thinking about differentiating the work and giving them just right math tasks like we do books for reading. So thinking specifically about doing conferencing during our current situation with COVID restrictions, sometimes we might approach it a little differently. So when I explain the typical situation, we would kind of approach the work and take the lead of this, let the student take the lead of the direction based on their work, where is our conversation going. But with conferencing replacing our small group or sometimes our intervention, we might go in with a more specific plan for a student based on conversations that perhaps happened in your student team or SST team, where we've identified a specific goal a student needs to work on, and that conferencing might be that place. So if that's the case, it's going to look just a little different, where we come with a task or a problem and very specific to the student. And in this case, there probably would be more teaching happening, more guidance from the teacher than in a typical conference that isn't in this situation. So they can vary a little bit. So these came from a book that is cited at the bottom of the screen that I can't read. I believe it's Minds on Math. I can't read it, I'm sorry, but it is there. So the chart on the left I thought was interesting. It might be a shift for some of us, and I thought would be kind of a neat thing to share perhaps in some kind of PD with paraeducators and teachers who are interested. The idea of shifting our approach from helping students in conferencing or working with them individually to this intentional conferring. The focus is shifted, the student's role, teacher's role, the outcome, and our inferred beliefs, and I'll let you all read that. But I think the big difference is the message that we're giving to students when we're listening to their thinking and acting on that is that their thinking is valuable, versus the students who, and I know we have a lot of students and we need to work on shifting that, who just want to be rescued, sitting and waiting for an adult to come and tell them what to do. And that's how they see, that's sometimes what they want from that conference. And we need to shift that and not give that to them. We need to nudge them. We need to support them, but we don't want to take the thinking away from them. And we don't want to take over the work. Really just wanting to guide students into becoming confident mathematicians, doing their own thinking, and knowing that we're there to support them if they really get stuck. On the right side, there's some common questions. And if you Google questioning, you can find all kinds of resources with lists of questions. Just in general, I think anything that's more open-ended is better at getting at the student voice and student thinking versus specific, closed questions.
So based on what Nico and I have talked about, we wanted to share some tips and takeaways. The first is be brief. Like we said, 5 to 7 minutes, it may be even less than that, but not intended to be as long as a small group might be. Keep it targeted, teaching one skill at a time rather than, again, overwhelming those students. Give genuine and specific compliments. Allow time for students to practice a strategy with your support. And I wanted to add another in here, that conferencing is for all students. Our conferencing targets will depend on individual student needs, and maybe how often we conference with students would depend on their needs, but there is always something that we can teach each of our students. So we need to be prepared and know the continuum of learning for each skill that we are required to teach them, and really take those kids who can be, all kids can be moved forward and take them to where they need to go. And finally, be able to confer with students in the classroom. You need to have a strong classroom management system in place. And I think that's really key to successful conferencing.
And finally, we just have a list of some resources. Most of them are links, and so we encourage you to check those out, some good resources on this topic. The last bullet is a book that I found online, and if you Google that, I was able to download the first chapter for free and read that, and it looked great to me, so I'm planning to buy the book. I would encourage you to check that out. So these are there for your reference, and again, if you have any questions, Lindsay and I will be available certainly by email to answer specific questions from people who've watched this.
Absolutely great, you guys. Thank you so much for sharing this. Coaches, do we have any questions?
I have 2 questions. So you both talked about who should have one-on-one conferencing, and that it's really all students, thinking about our tier 1 instruction. I guess my question would be, how often should this happen with a particular student? So should students be meeting with the teacher every day, every other day, once a week? How often would you say teachers should shoot for?
I can go first, I guess. I think it just, the not specific answer would be it would vary. But I think that teachers, if we think about right now, if we're doing this in place of pulling small groups together because we can't physically do that, then it would be as often as you have that independent work time for students. So if you're able to do small groups virtually, that's great. I would still encourage that there are days when you do one-on-one, because there's so much benefit to that one-on-one conversation. But I think every day teachers should be meeting with kids one way or the other. So the frequency for students would be based on, for some kids, if, as I mentioned before, if they have perhaps an SST plan that documents they need to meet with a teacher one-on-one 3 times a week for 5 minutes, something like that, then of course you want to follow that. Otherwise, I think it's based on need. Just again, knowing your students, keeping track of their progress in this current instruction that's happening in that area in your classroom. Kids who are struggling, you might work with more, but also kids who already are doing really well. We want to keep them engaged. We want to keep them learning. So I think it might be that those kids, those outliers, might get a little more time, but every student should, I would say, at least once a week be meeting one-on-one with the teacher would be ideal. I know it sounds probably difficult when you're getting going on this, but I think once you get into a flow, you see the value of it. I think students see the value of it, and it becomes something that it just happens because you enjoy it so much, and it works so well. So getting into the routine is the hardest part, and then it takes off. So that was a long, not clear answer, but
it was good. It was a good answer.
I think it's something you have to figure out, but minimally, I would say 1 time a week. Lindsay, what do you think?
I absolutely echo everything that Kathy just said. I would just add that I've heard a lot of teachers say they're struggling to build the relationships they want to have with teachers this year just because of the situation that we're in. And this is the perfect opportunity to spend one-on-one time with those kids. And so the more often you can do it, the better you're going to feel about your relationship with the students, the harder those students are going to work, and the better they're going to feel as well.
And then my second question is, you talk about jotting notes at the end so that you can go back and reflect and follow up. And I see at the end of your slideshow that you did link in, I think it was Jennifer Finley, where it did say templates. Are there specific templates that you have found that have worked really well for yourselves or for teachers when meeting that we could maybe link, or is that the best place for them to go?
I can ask around and ask teachers to share some of theirs. I've seen teachers do it in a lot of different ways. I've seen some teachers have a grid of all their student names on one piece of paper, and when they conference with them, they just jot the notes from that week and hang on to those. I've seen more formal sheets that people keep that are for individual students. So I really think it depends on how you as a teacher want to organize that information. But certainly if you're looking for a template, I'm happy to share any of those with teachers.
And I could do the same. And I think part of the record keeping would also be looking at the whole class. So for example, going back to our idea of sorting work from last time, if we sort the work as one way of determining conferences, then that work sort document that I do, where I kind of grouping kids and putting skills and needs and strengths, part of that could be documenting kids I specifically want to meet one-on-one with because of a certain reason, and keeping track on that. So it might be that you have paperwork that goes with your current unit of instruction to keep track of it, or it might be, ongoing throughout a quarter of the school year or for the entire school year, set up by time frame or by student, or, it really is a teacher preference on what makes sense to them and what's easy. Some people, I think, use sticky notes and then stick them into notebooks because it's easier than carrying notebooks around. Lots of different ways to do it.
I'm thinking that information like this would be really helpful if you do have to bring a student to SST. And I'm also thinking about formative assessments, that this in itself would be a form of formative assessment, something that I think maybe is a little bit of a struggle with understanding with distance because it's different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a perfect formative assessment for distance, because when I think about talking with teachers recently about how to, do a Bridges unit test with kids who are working remotely, and there's always the concern, I don't know how much they've done on their own, or when you're live with them, and I've suggested pick a few tasks that kind of cover the content and do them in a conversation rather than give them 3 pages of a unit test, and gather that information from that conversation. I think you'll get more out of that than the 3 pages of paperwork. So I think it's perfect for remote.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. Again, fantastic. We'll include all of the resources with the video. And we are so delighted to have you back again. You guys are great. And we'll have to do it again.
Definitely.
We will see everybody next week when we are talking about Tier 1 intervention. See you guys then.